private company search for flight MH370. That airliner vanished from radar screens back in 2014 on a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing.
A massive Boeing 777 carrying 239 people vanished into thin air. No distress call, no emergency signal, just a routine flight that never arrived. For hours, search teams looked in the wrong ocean. Days turned into weeks, and the world watched in disbelief as one of the biggest aviation mysteries unfolded. How does a plane simply disappear in the modern era, and why do we still have no answers? Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was supposed to be just another routine overnight flight. It was March 8, 2014, and the Boeing 777-200ER was scheduled to carry 239 people from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. A 6-hour journey, nothing out of the ordinary. The passengers, a mix of business travelers, families and tourists, settled into their seats, expecting to wake up in China the next morning. At 12:41 a.m., the aircraft lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Everything seemed fine. The pilots, Captain Zahadi Ahmad Shah and First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, were experienced, and the weather was clear. The plane climbed steadily, reaching its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet as it approached the South China Sea. The last official contact came at 1:19 a.m. when the cockpit radioed Malaysian Air Traffic Control with a simple message: "Good night, Malaysian 370.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
That was the last time anyone heard from them. Minutes later, as the plane prepared to cross into Vietnamese airspace, something strange happened. The aircraft vanished from civilian radar. There was no distress call, no emergency alert, just silence. Air traffic controllers in Vietnam tried to reach the pilots but got nothing in return. Alarmed, they asked another nearby aircraft to try making contact. That pilot reported back that he could hear only static and faint mumbling from MH370's cockpit. At first there was confusion. Air traffic controllers assumed a communication error or a temporary glitch, but as minutes turned into hours, panic set in. The flight was gone. No radio signals, no transporter data, just a space where the plane should have been. Authorities launched an immediate search in the South China Sea, where MH370 was last seen on radar. But as reports trickled in, things got even stranger. Malaysian military radar picked up an unknown aircraft making an unexpected turn westwards, back over the Malay Peninsula. At first, no one knew what to make of it. Then, after hours of analysis, officials released that the unknown aircraft was likely Flight 370. The new flight path didn't make sense. Instead of heading north to Beijing, the plane had turned sharply to the left, flying back over Malaysia towards the Indian Ocean. The transponder, the device that allowed air traffic controllers to track the plane, had been manually turned off. For hours, Flight 370 kept flying in the dark, completely off the grid. No distress signal, no sign of trouble, just a silent aircraft making an unexplained journey. The only clue was a series of pings received by a satellite, suggesting the plane continued flying for nearly 7 more hours after it disappeared from radar. Then, at some point, the signal stopped. The world woke up to the shocking news. A massive passenger jet had vanished without a trace. Families gathered at airports, desperate for answers. Search teams scrambled to find any sign of wreckage, but the more investigators dug, the deeper the mystery became.
The disappearance of this aircraft was an act of man.
Without any shadow of doubt, this was controlled by a professional pilot who knew a 777, and he also knows the airspace.
Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was supposed to be just another routine trip across Asia, but within an hour of takeoff, everything changed. At 1:21 a.m., somewhere over the South China Sea, the plane vanished from civilian radar without warning. One moment, air traffic controllers were tracking it as it cruised toward Vietnamese airspace. The next, it was gone. No distress signal, no emergency call, just silence. Air traffic control in Ho Chi Minh City expected a routine handoff from their Malaysian counterparts, but MH370 never checked in. At first, controllers assumed there was a communication issue. Pilots sometimes switched to the wrong frequency or experienced temporary radio blackouts. But as minutes passed with no response, the concern turned into panic. Vietnamese authorities reached out to nearby flights, asking if anyone had heard from the missing aircraft. One pilot flying near MH370 managed to briefly connect using the emergency frequency, but what he heard only added to the confusion. Faint mumbling and static. There was no clear voice, no explanation, just an eerie, broken transmission before all contact was lost again. The search began immediately. Authorities focused on the South China Sea, where the plane had last been seen. Search and rescue teams scoured the waters, expecting to find wreckage floating somewhere along the expected flight path. But hours turned into days, and there was nothing. No debris, no signals, no sign that the plane had ever crashed. Then a stunning revelation came to light. Malaysian military radar had tracked an unidentified aircraft moving west, in the complete opposite direction of its planned route. At first, no one made the connection, but as data was analyzed, it became clear. This wasn't just any aircraft, it was MH370. Somewhere after losing contact, the plane had made a sharp left turn, flying back across the Malay Peninsula. The transponder had been manually shut off, making the aircraft invisible to civilian radar. But military systems had still picked it up, watching as it continued northwest toward the Andaman Sea. It was flying in a controlled manner, not spiraling out of control, which suggested someone was still at the controls. The initial search in the South China Sea was called off, and attention shifted toward the Indian Ocean. But this was a search unlike any before. The ocean was massive, with some areas deeper than 15,000 feet. Without knowing exactly where the plane had gone down, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was the size of an entire continent. When Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared, the world expected a quick search and recovery. After all, modern aircraft are built with advanced tracking systems, and search and rescue teams are trained for emergencies like this. But as hours turned into days and days into weeks, it became clear this was no ordinary disappearance. The initial search focused on the South China Sea, where the plane was last seen on radar. Dozens of ships and aircraft from multiple countries, including Malaysia, Vietnam, China, and the United States, scoured the waters, expecting to find floating debris. But there was nothing. No wreckage, no oil slicks, not even a seat cushion. It was as if the plane had vanished into thin air. Then came the shocking news from Malaysian officials. Military radar had tracked the plane flying west, completely off course. That meant the South China Sea search was pointless. The plane wasn't there. The focus immediately shifted to the Indian Ocean, but this only made things harder. The Indian Ocean is one of the largest and deepest bodies of water on Earth. Some parts of it are more than 15,000 feet deep, with underwater mountains and trenches that had never been mapped in detail. Searching this vast remote area was like looking for a single grain of sand on a beach, except the beach was the size of an entire continent. Despite the challenges, the search continued. Australia took the lead, coordinating efforts with Malaysia, China, and several other countries. Satellite data showed that MH370 had continued flying for almost 7 more hours after losing contact, with its final location somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. That gave search teams a rough area to work with, but it was still a massive stretch of open water. High-tech sonar equipment was deployed, scanning the ocean floor for any sign of the wreckage. Deep-sea drones and underwater vehicles were sent down to explore promising leads. Ships dragged equipment across the seabed, mapping it in detail for the first time. Billions of dollars were spent on this effort, making it one of the most expensive searches in aviation history. Years passed. Pieces of debris, like a flaperon, washed up on distant shores, confirming that the plane had indeed crashed into the ocean. But the main wreckage and the black boxes, the key to solving the mystery, were never found. The search faced setback after setback. Bad weather slowed operations. The depth of the ocean made it nearly impossible to explore some areas. At times, teams thought they had found something, only to realize it was just another underwater mountain.
1 year, 4 months after that plane vanished with 239 on board. The new clues from that piece of a wing discovered on a remote island. A number etched on the side tonight, authorities telling ABC News it matches a Boeing 777.
For over a year after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished, the world waited for a breakthrough. Search teams had scanned thousands of miles of ocean, hoping to find the wreckage, but the Indian Ocean refused to give up its secrets. Families of the missing passengers clung to hope, but without any physical evidence, there were more questions than answers. Then, on July 29, 2015, a piece of an airplane washed up on the shores of Reunion Island, a small French territory in the Indian Ocean.
Angle of that flap, a clue about how the jet may have gone down. Also tonight, the suitcase washing up too.
The discovery was huge. The piece, known as a flaperon, belonged to a Boeing 777, the same model as flight MH370. Experts examined it, and after weeks of analysis, Malaysian officials confirmed what many had feared. This debris came from the missing plane. For the first time, there was proof that MH370 had crashed into the ocean. The flaperon was covered in barnacles, meaning it had been drifting in the ocean for a long time. Oceanographers studied the currents and patterns of how objects move through water, trying to trace where the flaperon had come from. The findings suggested that the plane had gone down somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, reinforcing earlier satellite data. But even with this clue, the main wreckage was still missing. After the discovery on Reunion Island, more pieces of debris began washing up along the coasts of Mozambique, Madagascar, Tanzania, and South Africa. These included parts of wing sections, engine panels, and even cabin interior pieces. Some of them had serial numbers linking them directly to MH370, while others were identified based on their design and structure. Each new find added another piece to the puzzle, but the most important pieces, the cockpit, fuselage, and black boxes, remained lost. One of the most chilling discoveries was a part of the plane's interior, found in Madagascar. This meant that at some point, the aircraft had likely broken apart, possibly upon impact with the ocean. But without the main wreckage, no one could say for sure how the crash happened. The debris confirmed what experts had suspected: the plane had crashed into the ocean, but it didn't explain why it ended up there, or what had happened in its final moments. Investigators continued searching, but the ocean was vast, and time was running out.
She saw a large plane with orange lights in the sky, with a plume of black smoke tailing from behind the burning jet. According to T, 2 other planes were flying well above the burning aircraft.
Ever since Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared, the world had been desperate for answers. How does a massive Boeing 777 with 239 people on board just vanish without a trace? The search has uncovered debris, satellite signals, and possible flight paths, but none of it explains what happened that night. With no final wreckage or black box data, investigators had been forced to piece together theories, some based on evidence, others on speculation. One of the earliest and most logical explanations was mechanical failure. Aircraft malfunctions are rare, but not impossible. Some believe that an electrical fire or sudden decompression could have disabled the plane's systems, leaving the pilot struggling to regain control. In such a scenario, the plane could have flown on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the Indian Ocean. But if that were true, why didn't the pilot send a distress signal? And why did the plane change course so drastically after losing contact? The mechanical failure theory couldn't explain everything. Another possibility was hijacking. At first, suspicion fell on 2 passengers with stolen passports, but they were later ruled out as asylum seekers. Then theories surfaced about a possible terrorist plot, similar to 9/11, but no terrorist groups ever claimed responsibility. If it was a hijacking, why would the hijackers fly the plane for hours deep into the ocean only to let it crash? That didn't make any sense either. As more evidence emerged, focus shifted toward pilot involvement. Investigators discovered that Captain Zahadi Ahmad Shah had simulated a similar flight path on his home flight simulator just weeks before the disappearance. His personal life was also under scrutiny. There were rumors of financial troubles and marital issues. Some experts believed he may have deliberately taken the plane on a suicide mission, flying it far into the ocean so it would never be found. The evidence was troubling but not conclusive. The flight simulator data could have been just a coincidence, and no suicide note or clear motive was ever found. Recently, Australian scientist Vincent Lyon has suggested that the plane was deliberately flown to a remote part of the Indian Ocean to ensure it would never be found. His theory supports the idea that someone in control of the plane intentionally avoided detection, shutting off communication systems and taking a carefully planned route. If true, this could mean that the mystery of MH370 was never an accident. It was planned from the start. From the moment Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared, authorities from around the world rushed to uncover the truth. Investigators from Malaysia, Australia, China, the United States, and several other countries worked together, analyzing radar data, satellite signals, and ocean currents. But with no immediate wreckage and limited clues, the investigation became one of the most challenging and expensive in aviation history. The Malaysian government led the official investigation, but it took months before they released solid findings. In the early days, authorities were hesitant to say much, leading to frustration among the families of the 239 passengers and crew. However, as more evidence surfaced, a clearer, though still deeply puzzling story began to form. One of the most crucial pieces of information came from satellite data. Even though the plane's transponder was turned off, MH370 was still sending automated pings to a satellite for hours after it disappeared from radar. These signals suggested that the plane had continued flying south, deep into the Indian Ocean, before finally running out of fuel. This was the first major confirmation that the plane had not crashed near its original flight path, but had taken a completely different route. In 2018, after years of searching and investigations, Malaysian officials released a 1,500-page report detailing everything they had discovered. The findings were both shocking and frustrating. While they could confirm where the plane had likely crashed, they could not explain why it happened. However, one detail stood out. The report stated that the aircraft's controls were likely deliberately manipulated. This means that someone in the cockpit had manually changed the flight path, steering the plane away from its intended route and into the open ocean. Whether this was the work of a pilot, a hijacker, or someone else entirely remained a mystery. The report did not assign blame, saying there wasn't enough evidence to prove whether it was a deliberate act of sabotage or an emergency that spiraled out of control. Investigators ruled out technical failures, stating that if the plane had crashed due to a mechanical issue, the flight path would have looked different. The final moments of MH370 suggested that it wasn't a simple accident. Families of the missing passengers were devastated by the report. While it confirmed that someone had likely caused the plane to go off course, it still didn't explain who did it or why. Without the black boxes, the world was left with fragments of information but no concrete answers. One of the biggest issues exposed by the MH370 tragedy was aircraft tracking. Before this incident, planes were only required to check in with air traffic control at certain intervals, sometimes every 30 to 40 minutes. That meant that if something went wrong between those check-ins, there was no way to track the exact moment or location where a plane might have gone missing. This is exactly what happened with MH370. By the time authorities realized something was wrong, the plane was already far from where they had last seen it. After MH370, new tracking regulations were put in place. The International Civil Aviation Organization introduced new guidelines requiring commercial aircraft to report their position every 15 minutes, making it much harder for a plane to disappear unnoticed. In emergencies, the reporting frequency automatically increases to every minute, ensuring real-time tracking if something unusual happens. Another major issue was the ability for a pilot or hijacker to disable a plane's tracking systems. In the case of MH370, the transponder was manually switched off, making the aircraft invisible to civilian radar. To prevent this from happening in the future, airlines and aviation authorities have worked on making transponders more tamper-proof, ensuring that key tracking systems cannot be turned off mid-flight. The tragedy also raised concerns about black box technology. Flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders are crucial in crash investigations, but in the case of MH370, the black boxes were never found, leaving investigators without critical answers. In response, aviation authorities pushed for new black box technology that can transmit data in real time rather than just storing it on the plane. Some newer aircraft now have automatic distress signals that send real-time location data in case of an emergency. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.